So I'm here to talk about, well, I'm advertised on geopolitics, but we're at the cusp of a new market. For the first time in the, unfortunately, 20 years that I've been working in this industry, the future is looking a little bit more bright and a little more certain than it has in the past. And the reason for that is that there are some very serious structural demand indicators that should last for the next 30 years that are really pushing miners and metals, and that's global electrification. So there's a trend that's been started. The world has decided they no longer want to run on fossil fuels. And to be very clear, before anyone gets too excited, I'm not saying that we all need to stop fossil fuels tomorrow. We're not going to, even if we want to. Too much of the world is heavily dependent on them. But due to the UN and all of the major OECD economies of the world saying that we need to transition off of fossil fuels, and to do that, we need to completely invest in brand new infrastructure and consumer goods. We need to move towards an electrified world. And that has some very practical ramifications. If we take all of our internal combustion engines run on petroleum and turn it into EVs, which many of us are planning to do over the next 25 years in order to meet the net zero by 2050 target that at least all the Western economies have signed on to, we need to make every single car on the road electric. Electric vehicles have about 2.5 times more metal in them than an internal combustion engine. And they have different metals in them as well. The infrastructure, all of the generating capacity in order to make renewable power for cleaner energy is all made out of metal. Those wind turbines are a combination of concrete and metal. Those solar panels are all made out of metal. Wind alone, over the next 10 years, is set to become a $1 trillion industry. And all of this is on a backdrop of consumption, generally, for commodities moving up at about 3 to 5% per annum. So 3 to 5% real growth per annum in commodities across the board, including the entire metals complex, compounded by having to rebuild all of the energy generating and all the generating and infrastructure capacity into things made out of metals and electricity that's generated from metals rather than generated from fossil fuels. The idea of that is great. It's what the mining industry has been waiting for their entire lives. They're super excited. But there are serious long-term structural issues with that. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. But let's talk about how much. The point of this is how much and which metals, how much, and over what time frame can we reasonably expect this energy transition that's driving this commodity demand to occur upon. So according to the big guys, Tesla and the International Energy Association, contrary to what we actually thought, fossil fuels are extremely inefficient. More than 50%, over half of the fossil fuels that we mine out of the ground, either whether it's coal, gas, or oil, we waste more than half of it in order to get it into generating capacity that's useful to us, like our car or our sockets. Nonetheless, so you think electrification sounds amazing, let's do it overnight, because obviously, and this is actually true, renewable power generation is far, far more efficient. What renewable power generation isn't, though, is cheap. We have, over the last 150 years, managed to put in trillions upon trillions of dollars in fossil fuel infrastructure. And in order to transition off of fossil fuels and onto renewable power generation, we need many more multiple trillions of infrastructure to be invested in this much more efficient, much more sustainable, much more low carbon renewable power sources. So it's going to take time because CapEx is always a constraint. And interestingly, so are the metals required to build it all. Moving just a little bit back, what minerals do we need to do this energy transition? It's a very different group of metal. Like if you look at the mix of metals that are mined in the world, it's based on our usage. As the new energy, the new paradigm uses a very different group of metals than we've used in the past. We use a lot more rare earths. We use a lot of what now goes into lithium-ion batteries, i.e. lithium, manganese, cobalt, nickel, and graphite. We're going to end up using a lot more vanadium. The amount of copper that we're going to need to connect all of this electrical generation to electrical usage, the copper runs between everything. It's like the blood in the veins of the global economy. It's going to be huge. It's many multiples of what we use now. We may or may not use a lot less iron ore. We'll definitely use a lot less coal. But fundamentally, commodity overall use is going to increase, but which commodities we use is going to change. We will use less of certain ones and more of others. So how much more? It's estimated, and I need to really caveat this, that based on present growth trends and present technologies, like the metals used in present technologies, the 2050 net zero demand per annum will be 500% more lithium, 500% more cobalt, about 400% more graphite, 161% more vanadium, and on and on and on. It says we only need about 7% more copper. That's not, I need to really caveat that with, we'll only need 7% more copper for the actual energy generation capacity, for like the wind turbines and stuff like that. When it comes to the connectivity, the wires, the copper numbers are a lot bigger than that. But what is that? We've done this, my team has done some homework and done some very back of the envelope calculations on that and what that means. Greenbushes is the largest lithium mine in the world. We'll need 11 times more of the largest lithium mine in the world per annum to meet that number. 15 times more than the largest cobalt mine in the world. 26 times more of the largest producer of graphite in the world. That's a lot. That's just to meet these numbers. We do not have that many mines, even in the pipeline, of all those lovely explorers that are desperate to be those new producers one day. We simply don't have that many. So what are the realities of whether or not we're going to be able to meet this projected demand? And what is the uncertainty of that demand? How sure are we of how much we're going to need? Now, we're not sure, and that's the problem. As I caveated before, there's a lot of things that make the future demand for the metals and minerals we need different. So these are the sort of major commodity forecasting houses out there. And as you can see, by a huge margin, they differ in how much, lithium being the bellwether of new commodity demand. The lithium metal is the bellwether of new commodity demand. And this is how different their views are. Some people think we'll need, 1,200. Some people think we'll need 4 times less than that. Right? That is the spread. And it's probably that way for just about every commodity out there. And why? Why are there so many differing views on how much more metal? The fact that we'll need more metal, nobody really argues about, but how much more is really important. Because how many mines we have to build and where we're going to get it from it's an important question. Why the difference? Economic growth. How much are we actually going to grow? As we've all had a little bit of a rude awakening recently, things like COVID and recessions and geopolitical tensions can lead to differing views on economic growth. And economic growth will seriously affect how much demand we have for commodities. Technology, as mentioned earlier, is a big thing. Is lithium carbonate or lithium-ion battery is going to continue to be the major battery going forward, or not? Could we maybe come up with a zinc air battery or a sodium battery that is a lot cheaper and easier to produce, making the present demand for lithium fall off a cliff? These things could happen. We need to acknowledge that the energy transition is based on the technologies we now know, and they could change very significantly over the coming decade. Government policies are a big part of that. And the government policies come in different areas. One, on what metals we're allowed to have, what the rules are about those metals, how easy it is to develop those metals, how easy it is to trade with other countries that have those metals. They all have the ability to curtail how much we demand or don't demand. Production disruptions. I was remarking to my team the other day, I don't think I've ever seen a copper forecast, demand and supply balance, that's ever been accurate in my entire career. Not once. Either the mine doesn't come online in time, they have development challenges, a pit wall collapses, acts of God are a big issue in mining, or suddenly they're overproducing, right? The price falls off a cliff and 3 or 4 mines go out of business overnight. So first it's oversupplied, then it becomes undersupplied faster than you could possibly shake a stick. Commodity, and that leads to the final end of it, commodity pricing. As we all know in mining, whether it's exploration, development, production, we all need capital to do what we're doing. And when commodity prices are high, you can fund anything. When commodity prices are low, you can't fund anything. And the volatility in commodity prices, because people have such a difficult time forecasting the future, is a big issue. So while I can tell you on a macro basis, I genuinely believe that we will be mining a minimum of 200 to 300% more metal per annum, one way or another, by 2050. I can assure you without a shadow of a doubt that road will not be even. It will be volatile, and I cannot for the life of me tell you exactly which metals we're going to be mining in which quantities, because nobody can. That's the real bet. Will we need more metal? Will we need to responsibly source that metal in a different way than we sourced it before? Absolutely. But the problem is the world's not absolutely sure which metals we're going to need in what quantities going forward. And what are the challenges to this electrification? And there's a lot of them. Geopolitics is a big issue, and we'll go into that a little bit later. There's one big bear, dragon, whatever in the room, and that the way in which we deal with the largest consumer of commodities and metals on the planet, China, is going to change very much over the next 10 years. The Western world, at least, and some of the developing world, have suggested that decarbonizing that supply chain, our very carbon-intensive supply chain, is incredibly important. Can mining meet the demands of that decarbonization? And can they do it without doubling the cost of the metal? That's still to be seen. Can we be transparent enough in our supply chain? 10 years ago, nobody cared where the cobalt in their iPhone came from. I can assure you, today, everybody cares where the cobalt in their iPhone came from. And I can also tell you without a shadow of a doubt that in every single one of the phones in this room that I'm thinking the majority of you own, there's a lithium-ion battery. And I can tell you about 90% of them probably have conflict cobalt in them. That's just a statistical reality. How long are we going to be able to do that? As we mentioned earlier, it's one thing to say we need the metal, but can we finance it? Is there enough financing of exploration and development to get enough metal? Tesla and Volkswagen love to tell the world that they want so much more clean, transparently sourced cobalt, but how many of them are actually investing in the raw materials to make them? None of them, I can tell you that for sure. They do not have the capacity. GM is the first car company in the world to invest directly in raw materials, and they only did it in America. Commodity price volatility is the biggest threat to the development of a sustainable mining industry in the world. And as of yet, due to geopolitical and economic constraints, we do not have a solution to commodity price volatility in the world. And let's go back to the geopolitical big elephant dragon in the room. Why is it so geopolitical? Why is mining the most geopolitical industry in the world right now? Because China owns it, at least when it comes to the lithium-ion battery supply chain. And with respect to China, and we do need to respect China on this, they saw the demand earlier than we did, and they have literally invested trillions in securing the battery minerals supply chain in the world. They might not mine it, but when it comes to chemical and refining, an essential step in processing mined materials, they own about 75% of it overall. They own about 75% of the cathode and anode production, and 70% of all the cell. Every lithium-ion battery on the planet, 70% of them come from China, and the other 30% come from Asia. The Western world currently does not produce lithium-ion batteries at any scale that is recognizable. And everyone's going to tell you that they're going to build these gigafactories, but they haven't built them yet, and they haven't financed them all yet. And if we're going to develop a low-carbon, electrified economy, we're going to need to diversify that supply chain away from China, which is going to be very, very difficult because they've already made all the investments. And what are we going to do if tomorrow the European Union or America chooses to make it so that we can't get certain components from China? Does that mean that we go off batteries? Do we go off electrification? It could slow down electrification, and they're trying hard. The reality is they can't cut off China and have a serious discussion. They can't get to the table until they develop their own battery minerals supply chain, which means access to the minerals, which come from all over the world. There is no country in the world that has a dominance in the production of minerals. They come from everywhere, and they always will come from everywhere. But when it comes to chemical processing, cathode, and cell manufacturing, we have trillions of dollars of investment to do in the West before we can even get a seat at the table. Decarbonizing the supply chain, as we've said, is very important. All of these net zero goals, OECD countries have, in large part, signed up to net zero by 2050. But there's a lot of steps in that chain to get there. We have nowhere near invested enough money to be able to decarbonize our supply chain. At the pace of change right now, we will fail. Now, they might put a lot more money into it and get a lot more serious about it going forward, but right now there has been insufficient investment in any form of insufficient renewable power or electric vehicles or anything else in the world to be able to actually hit the net zero goals. It's just a fact. But we have made all these goals and we've put in all these laws. We won't be able to buy an internal combustion engine in this country in 7 years. It'll be illegal. You will have to buy some form of electric vehicle. At present, we have 7% penetration, and that includes hybrids. How are we going to get the metal to build those cars if we don't have any gigafactories, and the gigafactories won't be built for another 7 years? It's a big question. Supply chain transparency. The EU and North America, they've all signed up to they've future dated it, some very difficult rules. The Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, GM, Tesla, BMW, Volkswagen, they've all signed up. It means that there's going to be basically a battery transparency passport on every ounce of metal we take out of the ground. So basically, when you get your car, you're going to get a breakdown of the full carbon footprint of your car and the origin, back to the mine, of where that metal came from. I can tell you that's really, really difficult. It's ambitious, it's laudable, but it's hard and it's expensive. And frankly, are you really going to want a car if, the equivalent of the Honda Civic or the Volkswagen Golf costs you $100,000? I'm not 100% sure that demand's going to materialize, because if we do everything we say we want to do to make that car, it's going to cost that much. So what I'm trying to say is we are electrifying, we're going there, but there are a lot of challenges to electrifying and making our minerals supply chain ESG compliant, transparent, and low carbon is very, very challenging. It is going to change how we mine around the world. And we need to invest way more money. This is actually from 2020. It's out of date. The numbers here are higher. The super cycle to double and triple demand for metals that is going to happen, and this is from Benchmark if anyone's wondering, 50 to 70 billion in mining, 15 billion in chemicals, 40 billion in cathode and anode production, and 130 billion in cell manufacturing. We're not talking about cars yet. We're just talking about cells, like battery, like the actual physical battery. Tesla thinks that we're going to need to, and that was just for cars, to go to fully electric renewable power generation by 2050. They think we're going to need 500 billion invested in mining capacity, 600 in refining, so chemicals and refining, 215 billion in recycling, because recycling is going to have to play a role if we're going to get all that metal, and a couple of trillion in cars. I think that maybe they're a little bit biased. One of the more conservative estimates is from the Battery Materials Review. And this is me trying to explain to you that there's a lot of variation in what that demand is going to be. It's all bigger. It's all considerably larger. But whether it's 2 times or 4 times, there's a lot of misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding is filtering all the way down to the miners and the explorers. Because if you don't know what the demand's going to be for copper, if you don't know if the copper price is going to be $4, $6, or $8, how do you make a copper investment? How do you know whether it's worth investing in the risky side of the exploration business? And that's what you're seeing. That's why, despite all of these incredible forecasts for future minerals and technology minerals, there is still a lag in investment in the mining sector. And geopolitically, unfortunately, the only people who have made serious investments in it are China. Say what you will about them, but they've put their money where their mouth is. And they've secured a great deal of supply. And if you want to invest in building a new mine, it's easier and faster, to this day, to go to China. Politicians say a lot of stuff about securing the next generation of supply that's transparent and low carbon, but how much money have they actually put behind it? And because of that, because the demand is so all over the place, because commodity prices are so volatile, the other people who could potentially invest in it, the investors like myself, have to be really conservative. Because we have to take the lowest case scenario. We invest other people's money for a living, which means that I can't take a huge risk. It'd be wonderful if the copper price was $8. That would make me really, really happy. But I need to do it based on a more conservative estimate, because that's the only way I can be sure in an extraordinarily volatile market what my safe investment is on behalf of the people I invest for. And the other, not to add to the complexity of commodity price volatility, you have the fact that the energy transition is still based, there's no assurance about what the technology is going to be going forward. It is already the case that over 50% of the cars, the electric vehicles sold in China, are LFP, which is lithium iron phosphate. They have no nickel, they have no cobalt. It doesn't matter to them. Zinc Air doesn't really use very much lithium. If we all switch to zinc air, what does that do for all of the present battery materials complex? Which battery and which transmission technology is going to be dominant, and how do we guess future supply based on that? There's some incredible advancements out there in graphene technology. And if you mix graphene with copper, you could reduce the amount of copper you need in every wire on the planet while increasing transmission efficiency. So reduce copper by 4 times and double transmission efficiency. That is what they think they could do if they mixed graphene with copper properly. But will they ever get there? I don't know. The point I'm trying to tell you is, as much as we have an incredible super cycle ahead of us, what and how that there's a bumpy road to that super cycle before us. And a lot of the conservatism in investing in the mining sector is based on that bumpy road. And the fact that we're probably going into another very weird political Cold War with China is only going to make it worse. So I think that's my conclusion. The energy transition is going to happen. At present, there's a huge challenge in picking which minerals are going to win and lose. I think lithium and graphite are pretty high on that list personally. My bets are lithium, graphite, and copper. That's my opinion, personal opinion. Be careful what you do with it. The supply chains, we need a huge investment in supply chains, and we need a huge investment in security of our global supply chains to make that happen. There are opportunities, but there are also challenges. And so anyone going into this business needs to, I think, tread very, very carefully. Thank you very much, everyone.